Hi, I'm Beth Novak Milliken from Spottswoode Winery, and I am here with Aron Weinkauf, our vineyard manager and winemaker, who is waving to you there from a separate room.
Hello,
Um,
everybody.
and both of our teeth, are they already red? In full disclosure, I think we've both already tasted the wines. Fair enough?
No, I didn't. I was actually just
Oh,
texting with James, so a big thumbs up to our coworker who's now a proud father of a baby girl.
oh, I didn't know that. I just found out right now. Wow.
Yeah.
That's big news. James is our assistant winemaker, so this is huge. This is really exciting.
Sorry. It's the serendipity of the moment, I guess.
I guess it is. I guess it's a good time for a tasting of 4 decades here as we start a new life and more decades. But Aron and I want to thank you for being here with us to taste through 4 decades. To actually be sitting here and tasting through 4 decades for me is quite remarkable. I actually started working with my mom at Spottswoode in 1987. That was my first year here, and so this is quite meaningful.
And I haven't been around for all 4 of those decades, so it's still fun for me too.
Exactly. Well, you don't have as many years of wisdom on you as I do. So there it is. At any rate, just quickly, to give you all a background of Spottswoode before we jump into the wines. My family moved here in 1972. So we were from North San Diego County, where my dad was a medical doctor. He had a private practice. And at age 39, his sort of midlife wild hair idea was to move his family of 5 to a more rural environment. We were from, North San Diego County, just inland from Del Mar, and he had this notion that he wanted to do something different. And so he and my mother had actually met at Stanford University and had some familiarity with Northern California and had some good friends from school who had moved up here and had purchased what is now the present day Donna estate. And they just came up and visited and fell in love with the area. And what's really important to note in the early 70s is that Napa Valley was completely and entirely undiscovered. So land prices reflected that. So when my parents were looking around up here, I mean, land at that time was $4,000 an acre. It was a very different community. Downtown, there were quite a few bars. There was a Safeway and then another market, today's Sunshine Foods, but they were really not selling the greatest things. There was no fine dining. There was a Sears catalog store downtown. I mean, I'm dating myself, but when we moved here,
a picture here too that's going to date you a little bit also.
Oh, that's possible. That's possible. At any rate, so when there's our family photo when we were just before we left Rancho Santa Fe. My mom and dad, and then there's 3 of us girls. I'm the one holding the orange cat. And you can see I have hand-me-down pants because they're rather short, but I'm over it. And then there's my 2 brothers, Mike, who's sitting on the ground, and then Matt, who is standing.
Do we dare ask who the happy one is at the bottom?
And that would be Lindy, who also works with me here.
Sorry, Lindy.
At any rate, so we moved up and we sold the house that we had there, and my dad sold his practice, and we moved up. And they looked around for some properties, and my dad, on a trip by himself up here, found an old estate that was called Spottswoode. So Spottswoode, for those of you who've not been here, was an old estate that was established in the late 1800s by a German immigrant named George Schonewald. He established the original grounds and he built the estate home. He was a hotel manager down in Monterey. And the hotel at which he worked, which was the Del Monte Hotel, was built around the same time as the Hotel del Coronado in San Diego. So an old Victorian hotel. It no longer exists, unfortunately, because it burned a few times. And they finally moved out to what the lodge at Pebble Beach is called the Del Monte Lodge. But George Schonewald managed that hotel. And so when he came and built Spottswoode, he used some of the same design elements. And that would be sort of the arches and the circles on the front porch. So he established it and named it Esmeralda, which means the emerald in Spanish. And then he and his wife, there's the estate home. Thank you, Aron. He and his wife owned it through 1906 when it was sold to a family who named it Stonehurst. And then in 1908, it was sold to a family who named it Lindenhurst. And they built the stone wall that you would now see out front and put up a sign that said Lindenhurst. And then in 1910, a woman named Mrs. Spots purchased the estate, and she named it Spottswoode in her late husband's memory. So when my mom and dad bought this property, it was already named Spottswoode. And kind of one of the good stories when we moved here, that gate had been built for horse and buggy because it had been built in the early 1900s. And so we, of course, had like a Ford LTD station wagon with the fake wood paneling. Some of you out there may remember those. A big 40 Econoline van. We had to take down one of the pillars and move it over 18 inches. And just to illustrate how different it was then, I mean, the whole town was just up in arms, and who are these newcomers and what are they doing to Spottswoode? And not only were we new, but we were from Southern California, which to Northern California, especially at that time, was particularly egregious. And so we had a few strikes against us, but they just widened the sign and put it right back up. And so here we were. It was an old vineyard when we got here, planted to old Napa Valley varietals. It was a mixture of Petite Syrah and Napa Gamay, and then also French Colombard and Green Hungarian for the white varietals. And all of those grapes were sold to what was then the Napa Valley Cooperative, which was basically controlled by Gallo. So this is back in the early 70s. This really isn't all that long ago. At any rate, set out replanting the vineyard. My parents, by the way, knew zero about grape growing or winemaking. This was truly just a lifestyle change. Maybe it had Matus, maybe they had Lancers. More than that, it was Coors beer and margaritas out of igloos is what I remember. At any rate, they were not fine wine drinkers. This was just a lifestyle change, and they had needed a house large enough for 5 children. My father wanted to drive a tractor, and my mother was an avid gardener, and Spottswoode sort of offered everything that they needed and wanted. So set out replanting fixed up the house in 1972, set out replanting the old vineyard starting in 73, finished that up in 1975, and then lo and behold, my dad had to go back to work as a doctor because he was earning nothing and spending more than nothing. And so he was an emergency room doctor for just a few years up at the St. Helena Hospital. And then very unexpectedly, when he was just 44 years old, he had a heart attack and died in November of 1977. And so my mom was left a widow. Thankfully, she was the same age. She had already fallen in love with Napa Valley, had made some very good friends, and recognized that by staying here, of course, we were all here, but she also recognized that she had a livelihood here by selling grapes, which she and my father had done even before his death. I mean, Robert Mondavi had bought some of the Napa Gamay. We had sold to Frog's Leap. We actually sort of encouraged them to get into the Zinfandel business because they wanted our Cabernet and Sauvignon Blanc, and we had a fair bit of Zinfandel in our vineyard at that time as well. St. Clement, other wineries. So thankfully, Mom chose to stay here. She was a remarkable individual for those of you who were lucky enough to ever meet her. And we just started, she started selling the grapes, went to people like Joe Height. She was scared to death of him. He was a bit of a curmudgeon. And she went to Spring Mountain Winery, and they bought the grapes and really liked them. And ultimately, she started selling to old family friends, both the Schaefer family and the Duckburn family. And they had known that my mom and dad's shared dream had been to make wine from this estate. And so they loved what they were getting in terms of the Cabernet in particular from the estate. And they encouraged her to make wine. So in 1982, she hired Tony Soder, who was our founding winemaker, and brought him on board, and we were off. So that was an exciting time to get started. Initially, our barrels were kept in the basement of the estate home, and the offices were upstairs where our kids' bedrooms were. Tony had a vision for this wine, wanting to truly make a wine that represented both its time, which means its vintage, and its place. And in that regard, he 100% set the tone for what our wines would be and where they would go.
Did we end up figuring out how your mom and Tony met?
We have not figured that out, but we need to, and that is a Tony question. And I think he is extraordinarily busy up in Oregon, but I don't recall how they were introduced, but he had been up at Chapelet, and they were friends with the Chapelets, just like they were friends with the Schaefers and the Davies and everybody else that moved up here at that time. And it's entirely possible that that's how the introduction happened. I actually don't know for sure. But Tony was absolutely amazing, still is making an incredible Pinot Noir named Soder up in Oregon. But he came and started making these wines. We custom crushed outside for our first, I don't know, 16 years. But anyway, he started it all, and then in 1985, he was among the first, I would say, that recognized the importance of a winemaker having a truly deep and intimate connection with the grapes from which they were producing wine. And so he became our vineyard manager, suggested it to my mom, became the manager of our vineyard that year. And he actually was instrumental in so many ways, but another one of them was that he brought organic farming to the Spottswoode estate. I mean, this was before anybody was talking about organics. It was something in which he had apparently a great interest and had read about and felt like it had an opportunity for success here. And he brought the notion to my mom, and she trusted him implicitly and said, let's do it. And so we've been farming organically ever since.
What did the trellises look at that time?
Oh gosh, it was so different. So it was all, when we planted, it was all AXR1 rootstock. So that original rootstock that came out of Davis, which of course will segue into our replanting because of phylloxera. And it was 8 by 10 spacing. So that means 10 feet between rows and 8 between vines. And it was just these aluminum kind of posts and then a little bit of wire up. And it was really what you just called California sprawl. I mean, the vines with it, the canes would kind of grow up and then just kind of fall over. And so to call it trellising, it was in a sense. I mean, they weren't like tree vines like the old vines that you find here, but it wasn't sort of sophisticated trellising.
Yeah. Got it. So all of the modern iterations that were kind of images in his head that we now deal with are things that came slowly but surely over the time he was here.
Exactly. I think Tony started to think about trellising right away. As part of what he wanted to do. And so there were we did make some adjustments out on the vineyard to sort of help to bring a little bit more light into the vines and make them just a little bit less bushy. And so that we could get just a little bit of a different profile.
Yeah. Hence the modern trellis that we have.
Exactly. So that sort of segues into the 1987, which I'm sure most of you don't have, because I can't believe how fresh it is still tasting. And I did have to taste these a little bit before, and I have notes with many nice exclamation marks about how fresh and amazing it still is. So just imagine that this wine would have been, the grapes for this wine, these were all AXR1 vines. These grapes would have been crushed down at Robert Pepe Winery, which is today's Cardinal Winery. Then after the wine was fermented and made, we would have brought the juice up here and put it in barrel in my mom's basement. In the basement in our home, it used to smell really, really good down there. And after about 2 years, we would take it out and we would bottle the wines down at Sequoia Grove. And so this wine, our first 2 vintages of Estate Cabernet were 100% Cabernet Sauvignon. But when Tony came on board in the early 80s, we converted most of that acreage that had been devoted to Zinfandel over to Cabernet Franc and Merlot and some additional Cabernet Sauvignon. And in both 84 and 85, Tony experimented with both the Merlot and the Cabernet Franc. He absolutely loved the Cabernet Franc and did not feel that the Merlot lent itself well as a blend. So whereas the Cabernet Franc really augmented the blend and brought that backbone character and a really beautiful sort of flavor, like an aromatic profile, the Merlot just didn't enhance it. It sort of stood off to the side and wasn't kind of a part of it. So we decided not to use Merlot. We're up in a hotter growing region up here, and I don't think Merlot it's not its strength necessarily where we are on these alluvial soils here in St. Helena. So
yeah,
we chose to use that
in the cooler areas.
Pardon me, Aaron?
Definitely like it in the cooler areas.
That's sort of what we learned. So this 1987 Cabernet is a blend of roughly 95 Cabernet Sauvignon, 5% Cabernet Franc, and it's still showing immensely fresh. It's quite remarkable. It has like that real rose petal potpourri. Almost, I wrote a light sherry and cassis with a little bit of saline and soy. Incredibly vibrant. I mean, I can't believe it still has the tension and the freshness that it has at this number of years of age.
Yeah, I'm surprised that there's still some of those primary fruits there. Yeah. Sorry to talk about it when nobody else.
No, please. Actually, I would rather you talk about it because you can offer more thoughts. Please do.
But nobody else has it though. So, well, hopefully somebody else out there does.
Somebody might.
Yeah. No, it's just it is great to see after 40 years that it's still holding up. You get a lot of those tertiary components, but they're, like you said, there's still that fresh fruit. There's still energy. There's still excitement there. And this has been open for a few hours now, so yeah, showing great.
Pretty remarkable.
Nice to see. But it's also curious. I always think that it's quite fascinating. Think about how different what Tony was working with at that period of time is than what we work with here within the last 15, 20 years.
Yeah, it is amazing to think about. It was such a different time and everybody was just learning, right? I mean, you know, you had to, where did we look to for inspiration? More or less Bordeaux, right? Of course. I mean, what else were you? There were great, don't get me wrong, there were great houses here. If you think about, you know, Charles Krug, and you think about Inglenook and Beaulieu and Robert Mondavi had started, and, you know, Christian Brothers and some of those great established producers. But yeah, it was just a really exciting time, you know, to be here when there were just new things happening and people were kind of coming out of Davis, although Tony hadn't. He was a philosophy major out of Claremont College, but people were coming out of Davis with ideas, and there was just this excitement around, you know, winemaking, and it was really new in a way.
Man, so cool.
So it was fun. And Aron today, as I mentioned earlier, is our vineyard manager and winemaker, and I assure you he will be speaking far more than me fairly soon.
Eventually.
That would be the ideal. But anyway, yeah, so I came to work for the winery in 87. So this was my first harvest here at Spottswoode. And it was, yeah, it's quite remarkable to think back 33 years now of that. And to be able to taste this wine, it is just to taste history right there is something special. It's very rare for me or any of us to ever be able to open these older bottles. So we appreciate you giving us this opportunity, truly. So come now a decade later, for the 1997, Rosemary Cakebread actually made this wine for us. She came to work with us in 1997, and Tony consulted with her and gave her passed on some of his knowledge. Pam Starr also did so, who had been here with us just prior. So it was very nice to have that continuum, that sense of continuity. And we were still custom crushing from the outside, but by 1997, so I alluded earlier that when we planted the vineyard, my dad planted the vineyard, it was all on AXR1 rootstock. And then starting it was in 1988, basically, that Tony came to my mom and me and said, look, I mean, phylloxera is out there. I've seen it. And at the time, there was a lot of denial around phylloxera here in Napa Valley. You know, people don't want to believe that, oh my gosh, you know, this disease that we thought wasn't here anymore can come back. But it was there, and Tony knew it.
AXR wasn't supposed to be susceptible.
Technically, it wasn't, and you're going to have to help me on this. It's a capital A crossed with Rupestris 1, and it was like 50% not resistant and 50% resistant, right?
Yeah, it has some vinifera parentage.
Okay. So in essence, it wasn't resistant, but again, we tend to have short memories. Although phylloxera had been here in the late 1800s, it hadn't been here for a while. And of course, after phylloxera was here in the late 1800s, then there was prohibition when
it's still here. It exists in our soils. It's native to our soils. It's just it's just that, you know, the native North American rootstocks were somewhat resistant to it. They could grow in the presence of it, whereas all of the vinifera from Europe was not.
Oh, that's it. I'm not see. I wasn't aware of that. Okay, so then when they have something,
it's still here.
So when they have something upon which they can feed, then they come back. They're happy again. Okay, so they explode. So that's really interesting. So then Tony had said to my mom and me, look, it's there. So we made a plan in the late 80s, and essentially it was, you know, when we do find phylloxera in our vineyard, and we will sacrifice the 9 acres that had been devoted to Sauvignon Blanc and replace it with Cabernet Sauvignon, because that was of course, and still is our primary wine, although we're deeply fond of our Sauvignon Blanc, so I don't want to say that incorrectly. And so after the 1990 harvest, we discovered phylloxera in the vineyard in 1990. So after that harvest, we followed that plan. We took out the 9 acres that had been devoted to Sauvignon Blanc, and we replanted it to about, I'm looking up at a map over there on the wall, but to about 9 different blocks of Cabernet Sauvignon, all using the Spottswoode Budwood. There's our vineyard map. So right behind my mom's house.
If I
More that way.
If I can try to do this in reverse.
Oh, okay, more behind the house. But anyway, so we replanted that acreage. There you go. Yeah, more that way toward the key. Yeah, to the creek and all the way down. But anyway, we replanted that acreage. And then in 1993, we went up closer to where Aron's face is and replanted that acreage. Down on Madrona Avenue.
There's a couple, yeah.
That was what we originally replanted in 93. And then we held off. We continued to pull Cabernet out from the back part of the vineyard.
These were 94.
And then, okay, then a little bit we did then. And then 97 and 98, I think we finished some of the rest of it.
You're in the heart.
Yes, right in the heart of the vineyard. So we set about replanting the vineyard and did so in a manner that would allow us to retain as much Cabernet in the ground, of course, that we could continue to make our Cabernet. And so this 1997 would be sort of a combination of the old vines that were still out in the back acreage, because there were some that we replanted in 98, and then also a lot of the new vines that we had planted more just behind my mom's house in 91 and 93. So now you're on, this wine is different rootstocks for the most part, still Spottswoode Budwood, and still a blend of Cabernet Sauvignon and Cabernet Franc.
Yeah, it looks like fortunately the powers that be chose to use pretty vigorous rootstocks in those early plantings. So that's why we're lucky enough to have the 5C, the 1103s, the 110Rs around, because they're still some of the most productive blocks that we have on the property. The rootstocks are awesome. So another thing we're thankful for smart decisions made in the past. Yes,
exactly. Well, and Rosemary just did. I mean, again, this was her first vintage, and I mean, you just smell and taste this wine, and she just did an extraordinary job. I mean, I think how youthful and expressive this wine is. I mean, it absolutely just like leaps out of the glass. It's almost blackberry pure, like a great core and fresh and juicy, and just go ahead, Aron, comment on it. I think it's just a heck of a wine.
No, I agree. I just love the balance. It was kind of funny in preparation for this. I had to go back through and actually, the 2007 vintage was one of those that was so moderate that I didn't remember a lot of the details of it. So I was going back through and looking at notes, and I happened to run across some comments that one of the critics had made. And I think it embodies it so beautifully, because I mean the down ends are just silky smooth. It's still juicy, still has kind of an acidic freshness to it, even though it's clearly ripened. Yeah, it's not at all tannic, aggressive, over the top, and yeah, shows quite beautifully.
Yeah, it has those powdery tannins that we kind of always associate with Spottswoode, and we also kind of always use a sort of a term blackberry pie spice, especially in the wine's youth, but that seems to carry, it softens sometimes more into black cherry or a little bit of cassis, but that's quite remarkable. The decade of the 90s was quite an exciting decade. There was a lot happening then. People by now we're into our third decade here, I guess. I mean, living here, because we started in the 70s, the 80s, and then the 90s, and it was just a time there were many more wineries that had been established in Napa Valley, many more people who had sort of caught this bug and decided to make a go of it. Robert Parker had really come on the scene in a meaningful way, right? I mean, so, and I mean, not that he hadn't been writing about wine before, but he was very, very influential, as was the Wine Spectator at that time. And so it was just there was the cult wines had sort of, been launched and come out. We are not one of those, and that's just fine. But there was so much, if you think about just this 10-year period between 87 and 97, how much in a way had changed, and what a different environment, I guess it was, in which we were operating in a sense, and making wines.
I liked earlier too when we were talking about it. You were talking a little bit about the transition from starting a business, being in its infancy, the luck of a handful of write-ups to that really help stabilize things, and then that transition into, of course, finding this property that we were able to build the winery and the offices on, remodel them.
Right.
But of course, that transition of how we really had to be thinking about this conscientiously and growing organically in order to preserve your mom's security in her home, and not sacrifice that while still developing the business and growing the business. And I mean, I hope, please tell the story about, just the opportunity to pick up this place, because I thought that was the first time I had heard it and thought it was cool.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So where we are now. So as I've mentioned, initially our barrels were in the basement of my mom's house and our offices were upstairs. And for a while, my mom thought she would like that activity, and then quickly came to realize that she didn't really like people walking up her front porch steps and kind of looking in this glass window and knocking and that sort of thing. And it was like, well, where are we going to go? We need a home. And there was this beautiful property across the street, which is where both Aron and I are now sitting, but obviously in separate rooms. And it was an old farmhouse. In fact, George Schonewald, who established Spottswoode, had sold this property to another German immigrant named Frank Kraft. And he had built our second-year barrel room here is the 19th pre-prohibition winery in Napa County. We have this beautiful stone building out there where our barrels reside. And right now our 2019 Cabernet has just as of this week been moved in there. And then this office where we're sitting. So what we did when we got this property, it was a 9.5 acre piece. So again, this goes back to pricing, and this was the late 80s. And Dan Duckhorn found out about this property and was really interested in it because he recognized that he wouldn't be able to continue to get Cabernet from our estate vineyard, because not only were we making our own wine, but we were replanting because of phylloxera, and we didn't have the fruit to give him. And he really wanted to ensure that for Duckhorn Cabernet, they would continue to get fruit from this area. These alluvial soils on the western edge of St. Helena. As I said earlier, he really liked and valued our fruit and wanted to make sure to continue to have that. So he bought the 9.5 acres. It was $1 million. This whole property, 9.5 acres, with a beautiful old stone building and this office. And I'm sorry to sort of talk about money, because that is not what I do. It's just to show the difference. We all thought that was outrageously expensive. I mean, how could you charge $100,000 an acre? And it just seemed outrageous. And if you think Duckhorn had been in it, I think their first vintage was 1978. So they certainly had cash flow. I mean, we were just trying to get up and running, right? So he was interested in the vine acres, and we were interested in the building. So we were able to work out something with Dan whereby we parceled off the front 2 acres of this 9.5 acre lot. They got the back 7.5 acres and with the vineyard, and then we got these buildings. And that was an incredibly exciting move. And at the time, we had a board of directors that consisted of my mom's 2 brothers and then a financial advisor. And of course, they would come up, and it would be hard to explain. They would come up on the night before, they would drink not lightly, and we'd have to have dinner with them, and then we would have the board meeting the next day. And even though we had done all this preparation, it was not always an uplifting experience. They didn't want us to take on debt. They didn't want us to do this. They didn't want to do that. And this building came up, and we were like, well, thank you, board, for your thoughts, but we're buying this property. And so thankfully, Mom and I, we had the desire, and we did work this out with Duckhorn. And so and what happened is that during the 90s, we were replanting. We had this building for our barrels. We had this building, which we picked up for our offices so that we could move out of my mom's house. And then we had plans for a production facility, but we had to put those on hold because it was early 90s, and we had to put our financial resources toward the replanting of our vineyards. So we didn't build the production facility. We put our financial resources to the vineyard replant. And then finally, when we were ahead of that and we were feeling more confident and we had undertaken those expenses, we were in a position to finally build a production facility, which Rosemary basically designed, kind of laid it out. And Howard Backen was the one who put it together. We were the first winery that he did. So we were very fortunate to be his first winery. He just wanted to get his foot in the door here in Napa Valley, and he has since launched well beyond. And so we built this facility starting in 98, and it was complete in 99. And that's sort of when it felt like we were becoming more of a true, of a business.
Well, and I thought it was pretty funny that after almost 15 years here that I didn't realize that so many people were against that, and so kudos to you and your mom for going for it.
They were not in favor of it, but we knew it was the right thing to do, and we needed to take that step. So I appreciate that. But it was it was an interesting time, but it was definitely the right decision. I think that both of us, both the Duckhorn and us, are probably like, oh, if only we had bought the whole thing, right? But none of us at the time could make that work. And again, we thought the pricing seemed so high. So that was, goes to show you what crystal balls do. But anyway, so then we were
one small picture we're going to be able to show too that's inside that same stone building, but kind of starts to bridge that gap because it has some of the pictures of some of those early generations of winemakers, and of course those who have came afterwards too.
Exactly. So you see, right in the front, you can see my mom sitting next to Rosemary Cake Bread, and then right behind the two of them is Tony Soder. To the right of Tony, well, I guess to his left, if you're standing with him, that's Jennifer Williams, and then I'm over to the far left there. My sister Lindy is just right next to Tony. Then there's David Abreu, who worked with us on managing the vineyard. Pam Starr is to his right, and then there's Aron up behind and on the barrel. He was
They barely let me in that picture.
There you go. No, it was that's kind of the team. It looks like an album cover. We should do something exciting with that.
Yeah, we'd have to color in a lot of pink boas and other things, or make it look like a Beatles album cover.
Exactly. Make it interesting. So anyway, that gets us through '97, and it was a time where we were maturing as a winery. We had kind of a sense of who we were, and kind of a little bit what we were doing, but we still needed to build the winery, and we got that done in the late '90s. So should we move on are we ready to move into the 2000s and the '07? All right, then Aron can do a lot more talking here because he came on board in '06 and was part of making this '07. So he'll be able to speak to this. But Aron joined us in 2006, as I mentioned, just to give this quick background. Jennifer Williams brought him on as her assistant winemaker. And then by 2008, he took over the management of the vineyard and took on that farming. And actually in '09, he brought biodynamics to our estate. So since 2009, we've been both organic and biodynamic. And for us, it's all about, if you think about farming and of course a family business, you're looking long-term, you're looking decades down the road anyway, but you want to take a holistic look at the whole property, the whole system. And in our mind, sort of the idea is that a healthy vine and a healthy ecosystem makes for great wines and also makes for a resilient vineyard. But we can get more into that when we get to the 17, and we can speak to heat and that kind of stuff. But '07, Aron, what did you do before you got here? What brought you to Spottswoode? And then talk to us about anything else in there and about this '07.
Well, I stumbled on winemaking pretty late in life. I had already gone away to school and really had my introduction to it over in Spain, as wine is part of life, and just came back and the bug had already bitten me. So it was kind of evolving from there. Eventually went to school at Fresno, had an opportunity to come up here and do some work here on the North Coast coming out of Fresno. While I had been in Fresno, I was working as kind of an assistant GM, assistant winemaker for a small but reputable winery down in Madera called Ficklin, which was an old port house. But had the opportunity to come up here to the North Coast and jumped on it. And it was always my dream to end up somewhere even young, that I just didn't have to leave from, where I could learn from, because I knew how long it took to watch the evolution of a vineyard. Wines aren't measured in days or weeks. My wines are measured in years and decades. So I was so unbelievably lucky to have the opportunity to start interviewing here, and then eventually got that job. So that was exciting. Started here in '06, as Beth mentioned, so was able to get a pretty good sense of what we were doing from '04, '05 forward. That was pretty exciting. So it's kind of fun going back and tasting this '07. You can see so much of what we were doing then. Just everything we had done in bringing all of our vineyard practices in-house, building up our own workforce here. It's the same 9 production people that do all the vine work and winery work. So we're constantly going in and out, and just to kind of be ingratiated into that circle and eventually, learn from it and learn from everybody I was around was awesome. So yeah. Seeing the '07, it's still amazing just how fresh and primary it is. And I must admit, I gotta give it kudos. It had been such a moderate growing season in the sense that it had been periods had been relatively cool, but there had been a few high heat spells right after veraison and even kind of late into veraison. But unlike what we had seen in successive years, we didn't have anything that was calamitous. So we didn't see a lot of cluster claps. And you can just see in the vine or in the wine right now, how it's just beautifully ripe, but still balanced. So I gotta give kudos to Jen for everything she did on that.
Yeah, it's an awfully beautiful wine, and it's fun to taste. And that's interesting. Yeah, just for context that you all heard that, Aron, although he started here in '06, that means that '04 was still in barrel, '05 was in barrel. And so he got to learn by actually touching those. And then of course, we always open bottles and just make sure people who are going to, winemakers are going to taste the whole continuum so that they have a really good understanding of this vineyard and what we can do and what we hope to achieve. And again, just like Tony, who set that tone, our goal every year is to make a wine that reflects its time, so its vintage and its place, which is this estate vineyard and where it comes from, which, it turns out is, we didn't know it when we moved here. My parents didn't know that they were buying on an alluvial fan here at the northernmost part of the bench of the west side of Napa Valley. And it turns out that is where they bought. That just happened to be where Spottswoode was situated in the house that they needed for 5 children, et cetera. So there was much that happened that was just clearly by pure luck, and we feel very fortunate for that. So we should move to the 17. Are you ready to go to 17, Aron?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to save time for questions too.
Exactly. So the 17, now we're moving, 10 moving forward 10 years, and yeah, it's quite a
Yes.
It was a remarkable vintage, right? There was a lot that happened that year. There was an immense heat like we've never seen here before. We've known that we're dealing with climate change. If you're a farmer, you know it, and we are first and foremost farmers. We have been adapting our sort of practices and things that we do for at least 15 years. I mean, in terms of irrigation regimes, in terms of investment in shade cloth, in terms of leafing practices, in terms of different things that you've made to your to the trellising, Aron, to sort of mitigate different things. So we've known about that we're living in a changing world. Obviously, there's always been a difference in vintages. That's one of the most rewarding things about wine. But the extremes are greater now, and I would say that 2017 exemplified that fully. Pardon me?
2017 was kind of the apex of it that we've seen in recent times. I mean, it was really unlike anything we had ever seen. Of course, so much of it is really marked by and remembered by the tragedies of the fires at the end of the year. But up until that point in time, what really marked that vintage and probably affected most people was the high heats right around Labor Day. We had basically 10 consecutive days over 100 degrees, with 3 of them over 110 degrees and 2 of them over 115 degrees. And it was heat we had never seen before. We had no idea how the vines were going to react. We're talking about a period in time where the grapes were sitting right around between 20 and 22 Brix. So this is pretty late in the ripening phase, and it was pretty, I mean, like I said, it was unlike anything we'd ever seen. We didn't know what was going to happen. We didn't know we were just trying to keep water out there. And then of course, as soon as that heat started to subside, it was just a watching game. We had the experiences of the 10 vintage where when we hit 110 degrees, we saw 30%, well, it happened 3 times in 2010. So each time we lost 10% of our crop just due to cluster collapse. So in 17, we were kind of prepared for the worst, and it was just the most kind of surreal set of coincidences. I mean, we were out there, obviously, as Beth said, between decisions made in 85 to start farming organically, decisions to then bring in biodynamics, all of the efforts built in the restoration of our seasonal creek bed, all of the insectaries that have been put in over the last 15 years, the overall care for our small little ecosystem that we have here. It all kind of feeds that resiliency. And we like to think, looking back, that it was that cumulative effect that really helped get us through 17, because what ended up happening was we didn't lose any fruit. We didn't see any clusters collapse. Mind you, we were out there, we were aggressively irrigating through this. All of our shade cloths had been up and in place for a month already. And it was just one of those things for us that you didn't know what was going to happen. So we started watching it coming out of that heat spell and just waiting to see if clusters were going to collapse, waiting to see how the vines were going to react. And it was really fascinating, because what ended up happening was it was almost like some of the vines really suffered. So we ended up going through and picking about 1/3 of the blocks. We didn't think they were going to continue to mature that fruit much beyond that point. We thought there was already enough ripeness and development in the fruit that we were in a good spot. So we brought that third in, but the other 2/3 continued to hang out well, and the vines really did well. And so then we started moving into that next phase, where after about 3 weeks of time on the vine, where there still wasn't any sugar accumulation in the plants, it was fascinating. So we had additional ripeness, but we didn't have any additional sugars, which is unheard of. You expect dehydration or just standard metabolic sugar accumulation at that phase of variation. And it wasn't happening, and we didn't know what to make of it, but we just kept sitting there tasting, going out on a daily basis, tasting the fruit, looking at every block, looking at every vineyard, in a sense doing triage, just constantly seeing if everything was good and going to hold out or not, and leaving it in place for as long as we could. So we ended up having about another 1/3 of it come in about 3 weeks later, but still with very little sugar accumulation. And then the final 1/3 we had brought in just before the fires. And so it was really fascinating, because I think the wine sits at like 13.5 or 13.7 alcohol, and it's just tremendously ripe, really quite beautiful and balanced. And yeah, it was really fascinating to see what happened to the vines then, and we still wonder, what those, if there are repercussions from what had happened.
That was, yeah, it was and I always loved, I remember 2011, for those of you who follow sort of vintages in Napa Valley, was an unusually cool vintage in Napa Valley, and 2017 was an unusually hot vintage here in Napa Valley. And I always loved Aron's analogy one time when he said, in 2011, everybody was freaking out because it was cold and there was rain coming, and, your phone is ringing off the hook. And Aron said, I just finally turned off my phone and listened to the vines and listened to the wines in tank, right? And just turned off all the outside noise, And same thing, I think, with the 2017 you said, right? Because everybody, the heat was immense. I'm sure that the chatter going back and forth with you winemakers, what are you doing? How are you going to deal with this? Blah, blah. And you just sort of turned it all off again and just tried to listen to, just really focus on the vines and listen to what the wines wanted and needed. And you dealt with it that way.
Yeah, it was always funny. I always found a lot of analogies and similarities between the 2011 and the 2017, but for almost all the exact opposite reasons. So right. it was a hard one to explain to people when I would come up with that vision of what else, everybody wants to know what one vintage is like in comparison to another. And so that was a far reach when I was trying to explain that to people.
Yeah, trying to explain they were like, okay, so I think I hope you've all had a chance. I think out of the 17, I get almost a combination of like really bright raspberry and blackberry.
Before you go there, Beth, we're just going to try to do one quick poll.
Okay. Are we allowed to do the poll also?
No.
All right, I'm
We
answering.
can get our mouses to work. Come on, Mike.
So hopefully you've all had a chance to taste the 2017. I mean, again, I get sort of this blackberry, bright raspberry, almost like if there was mocha or cocoa dusted on the ripe raspberries. Really juicy, really exuberant. I think it's been considered one of the wines of the vintage. Which, and one thing to point out, and then we're going to go right into questions and answers. But I'm not a winemaker. Aron does all of this. I would never try to. Oh, and he's
some results coming in from the poll. It looks like
10 years wins.
Fortunately, there's 5% of you out there that can say, I can't wait to drink it. So that's
I love that.
A few,
that's a good
8% of you that want to drink it less than 5 years or younger. 31% of you holding up for 10 years. And then a couple of you wise sages that either drink it anytime and enjoy it all the time, or are holding up for it to be a little bit older.
Awesome. So just the last thing to point out, and then we'll go into Q&A, is just that, for a property like ours, a winery like ours, I mean, making every year, and now I'm sort of saying this probably too many times, but making a wine of its time and its place. We're making the very best wine that Mother Nature allows us to make every single year, and we are farmers first. And so when you can making a great wine in a great vintage, is something that you should be able to do, correct? I mean, that's just saying you need to be able to do that if you're going to be in this world and
we at least want to strive for it.
You just want to strive for it. But in these challenging vintages, when you can make a really compelling wine and one of the wines of the vintage in a challenging vintage, to me and to us, that speaks volumes and almost more about an estate. So because it's just and a winemaker and vineyard manager and how it's being handled, because that's just so important. And again, we do believe that how we farm and the care we give to our vineyard gives our vines the resilience to carry through these extremes that we're experiencing. And it's just keeping an eye on what we do, and we live here and work here. And so that is that. And we will now open it up for questions, unless Aron, you have something that you wish to close with.
No, and I was just going to say, obviously, we're so blessed to be set up in this circumstance where we very much have a true estate model, where it is a cumulative effort across all of us. We're all here, we live close by, we work here inside and out. And so to be able to nimbly react, to be able to go out there constantly and have multiple eyes on it, and have the wealth of knowledge from everybody I work with, just helping feed that, it's invaluable. So it's always those things for me that get us through the most challenging times. 17 was a perfect example. I was evacuated, so I had to leave and couldn't get back here. I think it was like an 8-hour trip for me to get from Sonoma back to here. But fortunately, James had been here, and he was able to stay here, and he was keeping an eye on everything while I was out. And so you just see it's all teamwork. It's
and we have a great team, so we're very lucky for that. Okay, so we are opening it up for questions.
And we'll absolutely say, if there's any of these that we're not able to get to, we will certainly try to get to them later. So please don't, if your question gets skipped, don't worry. So let's see here. I'm going to go to the first one just because it's kind of part and parcel to what we're talking about. Are you concerned about smoke taint in your 2017 vintage? I can say absolutely not. We were fully picked off before the fires. There isn't smoke taint once the fruit is processed and in tank. It's a combination of you don't have the same concentrations of smoke inside, and at that point in time, you're in a tank and you have some CO2, some other things going on in the tank that's blowing that off. So that environment in the tank is fully protected. We had 2 vineyards that we were purchasing fruit from for fruit that would have gone into Lindenhurst, and they were affected by the fires. They were in the direct path of the fires. and we ended up not using that fruit, obviously. But so in general, despite the fact that it's probably the biggest market and the thing that everybody thinks about the most, it's really for us almost a non-entity, and so much more about how one really managed those heat spells. Cool. What's the next one we want to tackle?
Are we doing, what do you think about the argument, the biodynamics? Do you see that one, Aron?
Yeah. What do you think?
I've never heard about that, so you have to speak to that.
I haven't either. We happen to be in an area and in a time where, you know, so many of our resources, whether it be labor resources, financial resources, water resources, are under some semblance of pressure. So for me right now, as I kind of mentioned earlier, I love the vigorous rootstocks, the 5Cs, the 1103s. If I could work with AXR1 and know that it wouldn't be susceptible to phylloxera or even own rooted plants, I'd jump at that opportunity, because right now I appreciate the vigor. I think that vigor helps get you through the bigger stresses. It gets you through the swings of droughts, and vigor is something that's a lot easier to manage than things that are under vigorous. So to me, more vigor is always good. It's never a problem. And the concept of needing to stress a plant is something that I remember a lot when I was first getting into it, and my vision of that has very much changed. The goal for me is, in a sense, you want to bring about a natural early stress so that your plants move from a vegetative state into a fruit ripening state. And, you know, it's just that natural progression. And so if they remain in that vegetative state too long, certainly you can throw off the balances of everything. But that's why, you know, we have the ability to irrigate, and rarely do we ever irrigate before veraison, because we want to see those canes lignifying by the time things are coloring up and we're starting veraison. We want things to naturally move into that. So that early stress period is valuable, but late season stress is not. It's destructive. It's damaging. It affects the aromatics. It affects the precision. It affects all the things that we hold dear. And I always like to say that, yes, we're making wines in modern times. We're making wines that want to have modern densities and be serious. But at the same time, for me, it's still so important that the wines be aromatic, that the wines have that dynamic to them, that they still have a freshness to them that's going to not only be something that I find charming in their youth, but something that will absolutely contribute to greater longevity also. So hope that answers that.
Okay, Lindenhurst. So yes, when Lindenhurst came out, we started making that in 2002. And relative to, and it was basically young vines. It was wine that we were unable to put into the estate cab, and then over time it evolved, because we would have such irregular sort of production levels. You know, it'd be 300 cases one year and 700 cases the next, and down to 600 and up to 900. And we just decided we wanted to give this wine its own personality. So today, the way we look at it is Lindenhurst is our Napa Valley Cabernet Sauvignon. So taking our winemaking expertise and the relationships that we have developed with very specific growers, and being able to make a wine that is our interpretation of Napa Valley Cabernet Sauvignon. There is some fruit from our estate in it that can vary anywhere from sort of 40 to 60%, but it's also fruit that we work with very specific growers annually, and it's our Napa Valley Cabernet Sauvignon.
Yep. Well, cool, and thank you, Nelson, for that question. So I see Marshall Gelb, who happens to know me personally, wrote, Aron, did you have any discussions with Matt Taylor about the biodynamic aspect of viticulture? Absolutely. Matt and I went to school together down in Fresno. I had already been into and studying biodynamics at that point in time. Matt was interested also and came up here, had the opportunity to do an internship at Sinsky that then quickly turned into a job at Araujo. And Araujo has been also practicing biodynamics for years. And so, yeah, absolutely. We've talked about it all the time.
Okay, and this next question by Phil Barr is a very good one. So how does the AXR1 rootstock influence the early wines at this point in their evolution? He loves the 91, 95 wines, which, you know, are the last on this rootstock, which is true. The 96, yeah, that's right. And then then he asked if vineyard terroir expression changed with the rootstock change.
I'll jump in because I have some
Please
strong
do.
opinions about that. I think yes, absolutely. AXR1, you know, was much more similar to vinifera, so much more vigorous. Your vines could probably hold, you know, 50 to 100% more fruit in some cases. I mean, how much more vigorous those vines are is pretty amazing.
Yeah.
So if you think about that, you have more fruit. You have wines that held their acidity longer. You have wines that or vines that would have accumulated or fruit that would have accumulated sugar more slowly because you're carrying a larger crop. And so very much you have a wine and a vine that's functioning differently because of what it's grown on. And yes, that transition into the American rootstocks and hybrid rootstocks absolutely brings about a shift. It brings about a shift. And I think a lot of that, you know, oftentimes I think a lot of that coincides pretty well with that shift you really started to see in ripenesses, in concentrations, and tannin loads as you move into the late 90s and early 2000s, because that's everybody was dealing with that same consequence. So I think it's absolutely big. I don't think it replaces terroir. It just brings about a different expression or different reflection of that terroir. That terroir still drives everything else, and you'll see the same consequences of it, just played out in a slightly different package.
Okay, and then decanting an older bottle, we actually didn't decant the 87 and the 97 here because we opened them earlier, but in general, what we would do with a 97, with the 87 or the 97 is I wouldn't personally, it's changed a lot and it's changing. It's beautiful and it's still holding up beautifully. But in terms of decanting, a super gentle decant on the older bottles, pouring it off of that sediment. And then generally what I do, because I love to pour the wine out of the bottle, is I'll clean the bottle out with water, shake it, get that sediment off the edge of the glass, pour it out, and then pour the wine back in the bottle to kind of preserve it longer. Because if you leave it in a decanter for too long, it kind of opens up more. But really gentle decant on the older vintages, and then on the younger vintages, really a great idea to open them.
Shake them, keep them for 48 hours, 72 hours.
Exactly. Dump them into a decanter, shake it around, live it, give it some time. When you're ready, pour it back in the bottle and enjoy it from the bottle.
So next question from Elliot Hahn. How did you decide which grapes should be planted in which place? I'll just say our property, there's a little bit of a shift in elevation. There's about 80 feet of slope, 100 feet of slope from one side to the next. It's all bale clay loam, but it's bale clay loam with different amounts of rock basically in it. So there are different drainage levels. Some areas it becomes a harder plant. That affects a little bit what we want to do, but the precedence of what and success that we've had with what Sauvignon Blanc, Petit Verdot, Cabernet Sauvignon, and Cab Franc do on this have really set the tone. And with the caliber of wines that we're making on those, that's very much the focus. I'll share more about some things we're doing with some experimental sections, but I'll probably do that later in writing, so we can get through some of these other questions right now. How have things changed for you personally as the head of Spottswoode winemaking over the years? Man, I think, I don't know if any of you feel this way, but I always feel like the longer you do something and the more you think you know, the more you realize you don't know as much. So I don't know, there's still kind of this novelty to so much of what I do. You know, now there's a ton of infrastructure that we've built in place. You know, my team around me, we've got great communication, so we're able to constantly give feedback on these things, and I don't have to be, you know, I don't feel like I have to be the only eyes out there. And so that ability to, gain that comfort with the infrastructures that we've put in place, with the people that we've put in place, to then just focus on the most important things, when you're in the middle of that high heat spell and you have to be making those calls and on which blocks can get water and which blocks can't, because we have 40 acres and we can only outwater 3 acres at a time. So there's big chunks that are not going to get water. And so just that ability to focus on those things and prioritize, for me, is great. That's probably one of the biggest things, is just freeing myself up to focus on things, and still always trying to remember to take enough time to pull back and take the time to observe, because it's those moments of observation that allow us to hopefully make better decisions as we go forward.
Okay, so there are other questions, but we are over an hour and we do need to wrap it up. And I'm sorry about that, because we are really enjoying this, and we cannot tell you how much we appreciate all these questions. We assure you that we will get to answering your questions. We'll just have to do it in writing. But on behalf of Spottswoode and my family, myself, Aron, and everybody that works here with me, just want to thank you all very much for being a part of this, for being here to listen. We hope you enjoyed it. We hope that if you have suggestions for us, this is new for us too, and we'd love to do more of it if you have found it to be of value and of interest. So if you have ideas for us, please share them with us, because we would absolutely love to hear them. But again, thank you very much for being here. Aron, anything to?
No, thank you. And like I said, we certainly hope to get to the rest of the questions and get responses back to you guys. So thank you so much for joining us, and we wish you guys all a great weekend.
Yep, have a great weekend. Thank you. Bye.